Thank you, Dr. Ward. Morning, all. Today's first session is talking about demystifying, not this. Right. So today's first talking about digital sovereignty and cybersecurity as it relates to exploring opportunities for the internet. And we have three well-known panelists. We have Mr. Niel Harper. Niel is a board director in ISACA. He's also been awarded as part of the top 25 influencers in cybersecurity. So congrats on that, Mr. Harper. We also have Lieutenant Coast Guard David Gittens, who's an extremely well-versed cybersecurity consultant throughout the Caribbean. And we have Mr. Robin Wilton, who is a director of Internet Trust and ISOC Global. So good morning, gentlemen, and welcome to all. So before we start, morning. Now it's good to see you again. I hope to be like you in the near future. So welcome. So in a great data economy where organizations are increasingly moving their business to the cloud and leveraging the full potential of data, I realize there's a clear dilemma. And my question is, how can you work collaboratively, grow and innovate within a global digital marketplace while complying with the new evolving regulations? It's in this context, gentlemen and audience, that digital sovereignty has gained powerful momentum. In fact, the idea of digital sovereignty and the related topics of data sovereignty and sovereign cloud, as we shall soon see, have been around for a while. However, they have increased in both popularity and relevance through the rapidly growing amounts of data, challenging cybersecurity landscape, the global political turmoil, and the changes in international regulations of recent years. So my first question to the panelists is, what, in your opinion, is digital sovereignty, and how can you relate it to cybersecurity? Rob, you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Donovan, and thank you for that introduction. I think sovereignty in the digital sense and the national sense has a lot to do with the way we would understand it as individuals too. So I think it has to do with autonomy, with what I think our social sciences colleagues call agency. In other words, if you want to do something or need to do something, it's important that you have the means and the ability to do it. So I think that digital sovereignty is an important part of countries' ability to be agents in their own right. I think, so there's one kind of concern that I'd like to put on the table early, which is, if you think about the digital world, the reality is that it's driven mostly by consumer economics. And as a major part of that, it's driven by data monetization. And it's also driven to a great extent by consolidation, because while the internet makes it possible to distribute services and products, it doesn't make it obligatory to distribute them. And the economic default is that products and services tend to consolidate. And so we see the internet dominated by a relatively small handful of huge suppliers of products and services. So I think that presents some challenges for cybersecurity, because consolidation introduces single points of failure, or a small number of points of failure. But I think that the cybersecurity aspects of it are going to come up later in the discussion.
All right, Niel?
Yeah, so I think we usually think of national sovereignty in terms of the independence and the autonomy of a state to kind of implement its own policies and manage its own rules and regulations. And when you look conversely to the sovereignty in a digitized space, it really looks at the ability of a government or a state or a business as well to really establish an authority or to exercise that same autonomy in cyberspace. And it also, if you look at personal digital sovereignty as well, it looks at your ability to use technology openly and freely online, but also to manage your own personal information. So to have sovereignty over your own personal data. So we've been seeing the explosion of personal data protection regulations, and to some degree, that's a way to claw back some level of personal autonomy or some level of digital sovereignty over how your data is managed, how it's monetized, and the way it's used on the line. But, just to circle back to kind of in the context of this discussion, we're really looking at digital sovereignty in the realm of a nation state, and it's really the ability to be autonomous and to be independent, to manage your own affairs, set your own rules, implement your own regulation and laws, and the right to not be impacted by another state or to be impacted by some type of threat actor on the line.
David?
Right. No, I realize people have different views of digital sovereignty, and in recent years, you would have had data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty, several sovereignties. But traditionally, sovereignty deals with the right or the independence of a nation to control what is theirs, to have a say on what is yours. In the digital space, digital sovereignty can be considered a country's right to protect and use its resources, its digital resources, the way it sees fit, as opposed to having other countries having control or dictating to it. No, the internet, as it grew, made it very easy for people to use and abuse digital sovereignty. For example, depending on where servers are, depending on where the primary websites are, depending on who's collecting the data, it's possible that some nations are advantaged while others are disadvantaged. So cybersecurity can help that, because cybersecurity deals with, I think, security assets, but at the end of the day, with digital sovereignty, you want to be able to control what is yours. On the individual level, you want to know that your data isn't just being stolen and used for other people to monetize or to use for crime, and that your intellectual property, your private data is in fact private. It's only to be used how you want to use it. So.
Right. So, okay. Thanks for your comment. So if I get what each of you are saying, your basic summary is saying that it relates to the rules and reference architectures that can help safeguard some of the fundamental principles as it relates to the individual island states. But tell me more about what you think would drive governments to assert digital sovereignty. And I want to hear more from the cybersecurity and then data residency, and especially Niel, Robin, David, the data jurisdiction and data protection side. And then let's map that from a cybersecurity aspect, because we know that countries, especially in the Caribbean, have not taken cybersecurity seriously. So what will push them now, or what are the driving factors that would say, well, let's take this seriously?
Well, yeah, sure. Let's start. Yeah, I mean, in terms we've seen an explosion in terms of data sovereignty. A lot of states are saying, hey, we don't want our data, especially data, public sector data, or data from critical sectors, to leave the country. You've seen that manifest in a number of different ways. One, from a national security perspective, but also from a cross-border transfer of personal data. And I mean, to some degree, there's an understanding from the perspective of protecting national security interests, but also protecting harms of the individual if their information is not processed effectively or in line with their personal rights. So, I mean, you're seeing a lot of countries assert, like, we need to have adequate jurisdictions when you transfer personal data. And we've seen the numerous failure of the European Union and the United States as transfer regimes. We've had, we've had the Strems 1 and Strems 2. It's looking like there's going to be Strems 3 as well, because he's already indicated that the new EU and EU-US data transfer regime is not fit for purpose, and he's going to be filing a suit. But yeah, I mean, basically, a lot of it is around public safety, national security, and the protection of harms. But conversely, we're seeing states, we're seeing organizations like the Five Eyes nations. We're seeing a lot of legislation in the UK, like the Investigatory Powers Bill and other jurisdictions, where those same rights are being tread on, or attempted to be to tread on, in terms of how people's data is managed, and it's often under the guise of, of anti-terrorism, combating cybercrime, protecting children online. So we really have to kind of walk a line as to, what's proportionate in terms of how we fight cybercrimes and as well as how we manage the protection of the right to privacy, as well as the national security of sovereign states.
Yeah, David, and then we go to Rob.
Now, in terms of motivation to improve, I think it has a lot to do with national culture. What's really valuable to you? Now, if you look at privacy, Europe has always been very privacy focused. Privacy is important to Europeans. Hence GDPR and other things. They believe that it is important to protect people's personal information. In the Caribbean, it's a totally different problem. In the Caribbean, our attitude is, if somebody get my data, what are they going to do with it? So a lot of the reasons that we have problems is basically because of our cultural norms and our cultural values. When the Caribbean decides that security is really important, that privacy is really important, we're going to put the regulations in place, we're going to enforce them, and we're going to put the necessary resources in place. I know a lot of times people say, oh, we can't do this because we don't have money. But if we see something that is important, money is found very quickly. At the end of the day, until we have a cultural shift where we see data as important, where we see privacy as important, we are not really going to change. For years, in cybersecurity circles, the Caribbean and in Barbados, people said, okay, we'll take cybersecurity seriously when a politician gets damaged, when maybe a hospital gets hacked, when something gets shut down for a long time. Guess what? All those things have happened and nothing has really changed. And like the international conventions, like relating to cybercrime and other things, that sometimes it takes us so long to sign on to, because we just don't, as people, don't see it that important. I remember people lamenting about us not having a freedom of information that because that sort of is not necessarily that important to us. Other people, Europeans can understand it, North Americans can understand it, but in the Caribbean, some of these things we just do not value. And until we get a shift and we decide that this is important, we're not going to really change anything. Well, what we might do is stick a box. So they say, okay, people have to comply with GDPR. We may bring some sort of legislation for GDPR. People may say, okay, internationally, they might tell us it's best practice. You should have a data commission office. We may set it one, but we may only put like one person in it. At the end of the day, we may just tick boxes. They might say, okay, it's best practice to have a national cert. That's fundamental to cybersecurity. We may set up a cert and again, only put one person in it and take that box. Because deep down, we do not value these things yet. And until that shift happens, I don't really see how we'll have the motivation to bring our level of cybersecurity, which overall, in terms of maturity, is very low. If you look at the ITU statistics on the Caribbean and Latin America, our levels of cybersecurity maturity is very low. And it's not that we don't have intelligent or educated people. It just is not a big priority for us.
All right, so I can hold it there. I know I got a question for you as well, but Rob, go ahead. Go ahead, and then we can take We see two comments from the audience. I will have them, and then we'll come back to some questions. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. I think I want to start by acknowledging David's really good point that actually the thing that drives behavioral change is when you can persuade people to change the values that they apply to the choices they make. And Niall knows this. I've used this in the privacy context many times, that the choice between good privacy behavior and bad privacy behavior on the part of the individual is a lot like the choice between eating a donut and eating a banana. I like both. At some level, I recognize that eating donuts every day instead of bananas will eventually do me harm, but each donut doesn't seem to kill me, so I carry on doing it. And the way to achieve behavioral change there is to convince me that actually, if I eat a banana every time I felt like eating a donut, I might actually live 5 years longer. And therefore, I might change the value that I apply to that choice. So I think this question of what value you apply to the decision is really fundamental, because that's what changes human behavior. Relating that to Niall's point, you're absolutely right, Niall. And for as long as I can remember, the tension between the EU and the US over data protection has been based on a fundamental difference in values. That underneath the EU laws governing data protection, there is this fundamental bedrock of human rights. Whereas in the States, of course, there's the Constitution instead. But actually in the States, the approach to data protection is driven far more strongly by concerns about economic growth. And I remember one expert at the OECD saying this is basically a choice between one group of people who say it's great to have an economy that is founded on principles of fundamental rights, but if your economy is flatlining, who cares? And the other side who say, well, it's great to have the rate of economic growth that you can get if you monetize people's personal data the whole time, but who wants to live in a society where your personal data is a raw material and a commodity for others to exploit? So I think those questions of values are at the heart of this.
That is that's interesting. In the audience, we have a response, a comment from Kevin Noel, where he's saying that there's a fine line here, as some tools can greatly benefit the Caribbean countries from a public safety point of view, but from a public safety point of view, cannot be brought to bear because of our restrictions on technology. Any comments there? Because restrictions on technology for me is probably due to lack of education, one, and lack of experience in terms of being of the fear of the unknown. Do you agree? David, Niall?
I'll start, and I know particularly at one particular technology that this person might be speaking about, and it's drones. It's drones, right? But I'll speak about other emerging tech as well. I think in terms of drones, we've seen a blanket national ban on drones. There's no appreciation for, one, the benefits of drones and the risks associated with drones. I think a lot of the way that we make laws and legislation and we approach technology, even emerging technologies, based on fear and the lack of information. So that they don't understand the impact of drones in terms of improving our tourism product. They don't see it from the perspective of public safety. They don't see it from the perspective of critical infrastructure, because a lot of countries are using drones to inspect their bridges and other things. There are a number of use cases for drones that benefit society, but you have to manage the benefits with the risks. And I don't think we've put in that work. And we also have a lot of regulators who are largely, they're lawyers, they're commercial lawyers, they're criminal lawyers, but they don't have a good understanding of digital law. ICT law and how digital law is seen as a specialized discipline. You know, I once had a discussion with a lawyer in Barbados, and he was saying to me, no, there's no such thing as digital law. Law is law, but no, that's not true. You know, you have a number of countries like the UK has a Queen's Bench division for technology law, and that's a particular court that have specialized attorneys who address digital law. They have legislators who are drafting computer misuse, privacy laws, who are specialized digital attorneys. There are a number of schools that have programs that on digital law. And I think until we start to have the knowledge, the body of knowledge, the informed legislators, the informed regulators who can balance those risks between the managing the optimized outcomes and the use of technology against the risks which all technology have, then we will constantly have a lot of these knee-jerk bans, these knee-jerk regulation. But there's also not just that. Artificial intelligence, use of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, all of these emerging technologies have large social, human, and economic benefits, but we just have to understand the risks, manage the risks, and ensure that we have a regulatory model that allows technology to flourish, while we have mechanisms and safeguards in place to protect individual rights, to protect harm to society and public safety.
I want to add something there. I want to give a follow-up, both Robin and David, and include this question here from Alison, because now we can have a conversation on drones all day long from a public safety perspective, using my other hat, as you know, and what we use it for. Yeah, David, what we use it for, and the lack of education and fear amongst in terms of controlling streamlining the uses of them. But Alison is asking, given our dependency on data and trend towards adopting emerging technologies, what would the trigger to make data privacy and cybersecurity important to make meaningful changes? To add to that, include there, my esteemed panelists, what measures would you put in place to achieve these goals? Rob,
all right,
want to hear that? Or David?
All right, yeah, I'll take a stab. Yeah, I believe a lot of it is fear of technology, believe it or not. In 2023, so many things to us when I say us, the people in control of legislation, when it comes to technology, it seems to be a fear. So the best thing is regulate against it, legislate against it. It can't harm us if we make it illegal, if we say only special people can use it. Right? A lot of our laws, to me, look like that. I remember when I was working with the Hip Care project, which IT was doing, where they were trying to harmonize like cybersecurity related legislation in the Caribbean. One thing that stood out was that the legislation in Barbados was really strict. You know, when it came to technology and cyber, it was like, this is illegal, can't have that. If you have that, it's possible someone may hack you. So our default position was say no. That when it came to technology and cyber, our law, I'm speaking specifically of what then would have been our major cybersecurity law, which would have been the Computer Misuse Act. That original act was frightening because it was no, you can't hold that, you can't have this or two, you can't have that. Right. It's fear. And I believe I'm still seeing a lot of that in our legislation and regulation. We fear technology, or at least the people behind doing these lessons seem to have a fear of modern technology. They may not understand it. So the best thing is make it illegal, severely restrict it. Right? How you can change that? I believe, as sad as it sounds, I think it would take the outside world to say, okay, if you want to do a certain business with us, if you want to be eligible for certain types of loans, you have to agree to do certain things related to privacy and security. Unless we do that, I don't see it coming from within us, because traditionally in Barbados, we are the people who do the legislation do not seem that comfortable with technology. And I believe it would take international organizations to say, you want to play ball with us in certain things, you want to get access to certain types of loans, you want to get access to certain types of cooperation. We want to see that you bring your cybersecurity or data privacy up to scratch, and that you follow international best practices. I believe it would take force coming from outside, from organizations that we respect or that we want to work with, to actually make a change. I don't see it happening so easy from inside.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And also, was in your response, Rob, draw reference to your European experience.
Thanks, Donovan. Well, I mean, I think, to go back to Alison's question, I think it raises two different sets of issues. The first one is, how do you stimulate public action on personal privacy? How do you get people to take that more seriously? And I talked a little bit about that before, about changing people's values. And that's partly through a process of simple awareness raising, to make people aware that personal data privacy actually does have poor consequences, even if they're not evident at the time you do something. Because that's one of the real challenges here, that the human brain is evolved to react instantly to the danger of fire or to the danger of encountering a leopard. It is not evolved to deal with the completely remote danger of what happens if you make a bad privacy choice online. Because the harm that results from that is so remote that there's no connection between it in the hindbrain. And so you don't learn that, oh, that was bad, it resulted in harm or pain, I won't do it again. So that's a sort of fundamental human problem here. But the second half of Alison's question is about government action. What would it take to spur government action on cybersecurity? And there, I think David's given one really useful indication that where it comes to integrating the island states and the Caribbean into other transnational systems like trade and payments and so on, communications, that actually there could be some external pressure to say, listen, unless you are a robust and reliable partner, we can't hook you into this network. And I'm using the word network in its most general sense there, into this system. But the second part, I think, is, and David again mentioned this, policymakers' low level of comfort with technology. And believe me, this is by no means restricted to the Caribbean. I'm constantly dismayed by the appalling lack of grasp of technology among policymakers that I encounter in Europe, with very few exceptions. And so we see laws like the Online Safety Bill or the current European child abuse regulation, which are based on, in many instances, completely unrealistic views of what the technology can do. So, I mean, this is another thing to guard against, is technology makers who, faced with a hard societal problem, like, for example, child abuse, seem too ready to reach for the first shiny object that is dangled in front of them that promises a technical solution. Yeah. And they say, oh, fantastic, AI can fix this for us. Blockchain will stop child abuse. I mean, these are nonsense, and yet they fall for them time and again. So I think there's a huge education process to go through with the policymakers, and believe me, that's going to be a long-term exercise. The last point the last perspective I want to give is one that, again, Niel and I have heard time and again, and it is the line from some governments: oh no, don't regulate, because regulation stifles innovation. And this, again, is nonsense. You think of who the most inventive people are, the most innovative people are in society, it's actually criminals. And the reason they are so innovative is because they are constantly getting around regulation. So actually, regulation stimulates innovation. The point is, the right kind of regulation creates an environment in which benevolent innovation is possible and there's an incentive for it. But the wrong kind of regulation just stimulates malicious or harmful innovation to game the system, to get around the rules, to make a profit despite what the law says. So I think there's some real, there's some fundamental challenges here about what you expect your legislation to achieve. And that, I think, the onus is on us who understand the technology to gently guide policymakers towards the right kind of regulation based on an appropriate understanding of the technology, not understanding, every nuance of how public key exchange works, but at least understanding why secure key exchange is important.
Niel?
Yeah,
Thanks, Robin.
Just to add to that, I want to just to give an example. Like, there's been this large push, Robin would know, I would say the last 5 years, the last 10 years, to build backdoors into the encryption. This has largely come from law enforcement, like Interpol, the Five Eyes nations. They've been saying, for us to protect you, the unsuspecting public, for us to protect children online, for us to fight terrorism and to fight the scourge of cybercrime, we need to have backdoors in encryption, because encryption is being used by the threat actors, which are a very small percentage of society, mind you. But that knee-jerk approach to fighting cybercrime is that we're going to fundamentally break the internet. We're going to fundamentally break how secrets are shared, how information is protected from unauthorized access. We're going to fundamentally impact things like internet banking, like how people share personal data. And that, again, is just an example of how knee-jerk responses and fears and a lack of understanding of how technology works, how that can impact how regulations are created. And instead of taking an approach like, there are a number of technology companies, the Bitcoin companies that can track illicit payments online. There are a number of companies who can help law enforcement with attribution of cybercrime. Bringing multiple stakeholders together, different technology competencies that can support law enforcement pursuing criminals, instead of taking that approach, which requires more collaboration and building trust and building relationships. They want to take a knee-jerk approach. Let's build the backdoors into encryption and make the whole internet insecure. So that's just an example of what Robin mentioned about fear and lack of understanding, and they rush for the low-hanging fruit in terms of solutions, as opposed to looking for a comprehensive and sustainable approach.
Yeah, thanks. We have a question from Dave Hill. What can we do in the Caribbean to develop the area of digital laws? Because from what you're saying, there's a lack of understanding when it comes to digital laws. Anyone want to take that? David?
That is a good one. At the end of the day, the actual policymakers would have to see as important. I don't think it's something that the ordinary man can do much to influence. I mean, yes, you can always push it via social media and forums like this, try to get people to understand the importance. But at the end of the day, if the policymakers don't see it important, they're either going to take years to do it, or they're going to start it and it'll drag on forever. And in the end, they may implement it, but they may not put the resources behind it to make it really actionable. And I'm sure many of you in here would know of laws where the law exists, but the resources to make the law actually real or workable aren't there. So the policymakers have to decide this is something important. I remember a politician saying years ago in a conference, he said, if y'all want a law, that law, you have to sell it to us in a way to show us how it can get us votes. He said, we operate on votes. If you cannot frame the reason for this cybersecurity law in terms of votes, it's not something that we're likely to support, right? And I've seen things since then to suggest that he wasn't talking nonsense. The policymakers have to decide we want to do that, right? And if they do, they can do it. They can. It's not hard. I mean, there's no shortage of people in Barbados who know law, who can write legislation. We can write legislation in a week if it's that important, and we can pass it within a month if we really want to. But the fact that some things take 10 or 15 years short, it's not really that important. To them, to the policymakers are the people that we have to sell to. Those are the ones that we have to convince, not the average man on the street or professional associations or the business people. We have to somehow convince the policymakers this is in the best interest.
Niel?
Yeah, sure. I think so. I find a lot of the problem with the developing legislation, especially really specialized legislation. We're seeing the cybercrime legislation, cybersecurity legislation, data protection, even things like how we manage personal data in new and emerging platforms or online transactions. A lot of it is done based on pressure from international organizations. So like a large percentage of the legislation that Barbados has produced for technology has come from either pressures from the European Union, pressure from the International Monetary Fund as a condition of lending us money, pressure from the European Development Program as a condition of giving us loans. Development loans. It's always pressure from external parties. We don't develop legislation or develop regulations because we understand the national implications. Like, we don't understand how privacy laws relate to rights, to personal rights. We don't understand how the relationship between cybercrime laws and personal data privacy laws to building out our digital economy. This is not being driven by our political representatives. This is not based on the understanding of, the dynamic nature of how Barbados participates in the international digital economy and what are some of the key drivers for Barbados to become more deeply embedded and participate effectively, and how this then translate into human, social, and economic development. Again, it's always driven by international or external kind of parties. And we see a lot of discussions from our politicians about digital transformation and making Barbados a digital hub. But still, we don't have a thriving ecosystem for tech entrepreneurs, and a lot of it is because there's no discussion or collaboration again from the public sector, the technical community, academia, all the different parties who come together and understand what are the problems and devise solutions. I'll give a really strong example. Like I sit on the board of directors of 10 Habitat, and we have developed a co-working space. We've developed technology incubators, technology accelerators, looking to stimulate tech entrepreneurship in Barbados. We went to the University of West Indies and say, hey, we want to have a hosted habitat in the University of the West Indies, whereby instead of us developing our students to go out and work for someone, we create we create incubators and take the students with ideas to support them and help them turn them into real sustainable businesses that they can leave school, start their own businesses, hire people, contribute to the economic development of the country. And there was a broader plan and a reference point in terms of Harvard does that, Oxford does that, many large institutions do that. And the response from the leaders at the University of West Indies was like, no, we can't do that. It would distract our students from exams. You know, that's like
Raise your hand now.
that's you know, again, some of the fundamental underlying problems in Barbados is that unless this is something being driven externally, you know, hearing this from Barbadians doesn't have as much weight as if the International Monetary Fund said, we're giving you 20 billion, and in return, you must create an incubator in your institutions of higher learning. Then they would rush to put those things in place. Most of the times, just to tick that box, that they will implement it halfway, or they'll implement it very, very, very poorly, but just to kind of tick that box to receive the funding. And we see a lot of that. And I think until we see more of these regulations, more of these improvements and innovations being driven from our political leaders, being driven from our subject matter experts, being driven internally as inputs and feeders into national development, like I don't think we will see a lot of improvement.
Right. So and go to Rob. Rob, you can give any examples you want to give addressing this issue, and then I'm going to take the question from Kevin from a law enforcement, where he's asking about law enforcement and the decision makers. I will answer that for you, Kevin. That's not a problem. And then we take any questions from the audience. You feel free to unmute your mics and throw a question at our esteemed panelists. So go ahead, Rob.
Great. Thanks again, Donovan. Yeah, so I want to come back to David's excellent point about the difference between passing a law and the difference between giving law enforcement the ability and the resources to actually enforce the law. Because I talked a little bit earlier about shiny object syndrome, and there's a really interesting example of that at the moment. So on the one hand, I think we want policymakers to draft the laws in a technology neutral way. Laws that are drafted in such a way that they refer to specific technologies are usually a bad idea, because they tend to have a very short shelf life and they tend to be inflexible and ultimately ineffective. And we should be very cautious about laws that violate that principle of technology neutrality. But on the other hand, the laws have to be informed by some kind of sound technical understanding. And so the example I'm thinking of is you want to be able to detect illegal content online. And shiny object syndrome kicks in when the policymaker is assured that this new gadget can detect illegal content with an accuracy of 98%. And the policymaker looks at it and they think, well, brilliant. I was thinking 75% would be pretty good. So 98% sounds fantastic. Let's do it. Well, then you go downstream a bit and you find that actually, if it's 98% accurate and 2% inaccurate, suppose there are 1 million pieces of content that you're having to evaluate. 2% of those you're going to have a human look at, because the tool can't tell if they're illegal or not. Is that 2% something that your law enforcement setup can handle? Or is it vastly more than they are equipped or capable to deal with? And so the decision about whether 98% is a good threshold to build into the law has got to be technically informed, but it's also got to be informed by how much resourcing you're prepared to put into the law enforcement effort. So it needs a balance of the two. And too often, I think, we get this, oh, well, as long as I've legislated, I've done my job. And what happens downstream in terms of enforcement is someone else's problem. And yes, it is. But on the other hand, the legislator, they're the same people who are funding the downstream activity and resourcing it. And I think this relates slightly to Kevin's point as well, that law enforcement capacity is something that has to be funded and resourced, and training has to be put in place for them to be able to take on that role.
To add to that, Rob, and this is where we'll put on the actual captain hat. It has also to do with the change of culture, as David mentioned earlier. And it also has to do what is important at that point in time. So we have a case where in another organization, we have the wants, you want the bells and whistles, but you don't want to provide the resources to achieve the bells and whistles, but you still want the same end product. And to change that, you have to change culture, you have to do a lot more education, and you have to do what we call, as Niel and I in our other ventures, we'll talk about the proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
You have to show and Niel knows exactly what I'm talking about. We have to show the proof of concept. And how can we do the proof of concept without the resources? Right? So it's like, the chicken and the egg, which comes first? Right? We have a question from Allison. Go ahead, Allison.
Hello, good day. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure,
Yes,
sure.
we
Go ahead.
can.
Okay, hey, good day, everyone, and thank you for the interesting discussion thus far. I have a question, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but we're speaking about the lack of legislation locally regarding privacy, data, cybersecurity, and we're putting it out there that true change might only occur if or if an outside influence requires it of the local landscape. But we're speaking about internet, and the internet is global. Is it that there are geographical restrictions to internet governance? I don't know if anyone could assist with that question. I'm just wondering, because in terms of legislation and regulating the internet, regulating technologies, isn't a blurred line between where one country's jurisdiction starts and ends?
Right. So, Allison, I know Niel won't jump in there because he's inching, but let me ask you a question. Let me give you an example. If you have a website that is hosted in South Africa and you are transacting business up by Rob in the UK, and I decide I'm in Barbados to go and create some sort of nefarious activity, where does the boundary lie? Where does the internet? Where does the boundary lie? Who's liable there?
Well, that pulls in the concept of a cross-border transfers of data and so on. So if we're theoretically speaking, the person who is hosting or where the server is located should have the responsibility of ensuring security, of ensuring that the data is secured. That being said, it depends also on what legislation the country, you said South Africa, might have, or UK might have in place. So, okay, let's say if it's EU citizens, so the GDPR comes into effect. So then there's still that kind of cross-country dialogue going on regarding responsibilities.
So you see what's happening here. You're actually now trying to find a solution for where there's none as yet. Niel, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the obstacles that a lot of developing countries face is their ability or their capacity to participate in international discussions and meetings and fora. For example, we have the Internet Governance Forum that was just ended in Japan, and basically, there's a very small handful of people. I would say less than 15 people from the region who religiously attend these meetings, and not just religiously attend, but can actively participate in a very broad cross-section of discussions about cybercrime, about internet governance, about human rights online, about personal data protection. So I think it's really important for countries to build that capacity, to have the right individuals who understand the context and the complexity of these issues and to participate in these discussions, because a lot of the decisions, not necessarily the Internet Governance Forum, because it's not a decision-making function, but there are decisions being made in the by TU and other spaces that impact our region and our country, that we don't have enough people participating in these discussions, especially the decision makers. We can send our CTU Secretary General, but he's not passing the laws. He's informed, he's knowledgeable, but he's not passing the laws, or he's not responsible for the regulators. And, we just need to develop our capacity to participate in these international fora, but also to build a lot of our bilateral and multilateral agreements as well, so that we're better involved in terms of, for example, the Barbados has been discussing for a long time about acceding to the Budapest Convention, but I think we're a little behind the curve, because the Budapest Convention is looking to go to Protocol 2, which is an update of the laws to make them more relevant in terms of emerging technology and culture, etc. But we need to understand the reasons behind why we're acceding to the convention. We also need to participate in other mechanisms like the open-ended working group in the United Nations, as well as the open-ended group that's discussing at this point the development of an international cybercrime treaty. All of these mechanisms impact us, but we're not participating. We don't have a seat at the table because we're not informed, and we not just informed, we're not even interested. I've attended a number of meetings that Barbados has not sent representatives. International law enforcement meetings where they're discussing cybercrime prevention. Like the last meeting I attended last year, the only representative from the region was the commissioner of police from Jamaica. That was the only representative in an international law enforcement meeting on cybercrime. Only one representative from the region. And all the other regions had multiple representatives. So again, we have to be interested, we have to be involved, and we have to be informed so that we can make, one, the right decisions when we come back from these meetings, so that we can take advantage of these multilateral agreements, these bilateral agreements, in pursuit of our public safety, in pursuit of our economic development.
Thanks, Niel. Rob, David, any comments? Not hearing you, David. Rob, go ahead.
Yes. So sorry, let me get my notes back again.
Hello, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead,
Right,
David.
okay, right, yeah. I agree with what Niel said, but I'd like to add in addition to us being interested and participating, we need to be more agile. 10 years ago, we were considering acceding to the Budapest Convention. 10 years. And a lot of other things we take so long, but by the time we want to look at, they're somewhere else. because I agree, now the Budapest Convention is going to change the international cybercrime. We are now saying, oh yeah, maybe we should sign on to Budapest Convention. The internet and technology changes much too fast for us to be taking 10 years to make serious decisions. We need to act as a region more agile. We need to be interested, and instead of planning to do something, we need to do it. Or instead of planning to have a plan to do something, we need to be more responsive. I don't see technology changes slowing down anytime soon. We need to be ready as the world changes. We need to do an assessment, bring in our SMEs, do whatever research, and make a decision. If we never make decisions, we'll always remain far back. I mean, that's the way we can put it. You need to make a decision on important things. You need to get involved. They're not short of brains in the Caribbean, but we need to be involved and we need to be responsive and make decisions.
Yeah. Rob?
Right, thanks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So let me start by reassuring you that Caribbean is not unique in that kind of timescale. For instance, the Malabo Convention in Africa on data protection was actually agreed in 2014, and at the moment, I think about 25% of African states have, I think something like 25% ratified it. Only about 3 of them actually done anything with it. So it's not just the Caribbean by any means. And actually, Niel talked about Schrems 1, 2, and 3. It's got more episodes than a Fast and Furious franchise, and yet it's in objection to laws that have been in the EU statute mechanism for years. So this I think what this does is it reflects an aspect of Alison's question, which is there are several layers here, and I'll just quickly mention 3. First, there's the laws, so something like GDPR. Second, there's things like contract. So if you want to demonstrate GDPR compliance, what contractual means might you put in place to do it? And there are things like standard contractual clauses that help you to demonstrate GDPR compliance, even if you have to do so across jurisdictions. And the other common mechanism is these things called binding corporate rules. And the principle of a binding corporate rule is you say what your organization is committing to do, and then you show it to a data protection commissioner. And if they sign it off, the principle is that that's okay around all the other commissioners too. But that brings us to the third layer, which is what I would call workable legal recourse. And the problem there is, I think, very clearly illustrated by the way in which large corporates particularly have done forum shopping to make sure that where they are the entity that can be sued when something goes wrong, they make sure that they're going to be sued in the most favorable place possible. Yeah. And I'm not going to point fingers at individual countries, but it is known that even in Europe, for example, that the regulators in some countries are far worse resourced and find it far harder to prosecute large corporates for compliance violations than in other countries. And therefore, obviously, what certain large corporates have done is register their offices in those jurisdictions so that if they are going to get sued, it will be in the place that gives them the best chance of fighting the action off. So there's 3 layers, the laws, the contracts, and then effective legal recourse give, I think, Alison, some indication of why this is such a hard cross-border problem to crack.
Right. Thanks for that, Rob, Niel, and David. We have literally 1 minute left, and I know the 4 of us can have the discussion for hours on end, but we don't have that time at liberty to us today. Any final comments in 30 seconds? Let's start with the person in the top 25 list, Niel.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So I am a big proponent of cyber capacity building. I think, there are a lot of a lot of different organizations. There are a number of different agreements around the world, whether you look at organizations like GFC, CE, the ITU, also a lot of work being done by the European Union in terms of their multi-annual indicative programs around cyber capacity building for developing states. I would really implore national governments across the region, including the Barbados government, to really look at how we can benefit from these programs and really build capacity in terms of just our national cybersecurity and strategy, cybercrime and cybersecurity legislation, personal data protection legislation, critical infrastructure protection, setting up and implementing our national CERT, building out a national cybersecurity awareness program, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of key things that we need to do to ensure that we can protect our national interests from cyber threats, but also at the same time take best advantage of online technologies and the use of an open, safe, and secure internet.
Thanks. Rob, 30 seconds.
Yep. I just want to endorse Niall's reply to Brent. We have to find ways of managing data in legally acceptable ways that represent the stakeholders' interest, regardless of the geographical location of that data. Trying to geolocate and localize data is just it's a dead end. It's not how the internet works, and there's no sense forcing it to work that way. We have to find other ways, which I think exist.
Okay, thanks for that. And Lieutenant Coast Guard David Gittens, 30 seconds. You on? Can't hear you, David. Still can't hear you. David, still can't hear you. David, still can't hear you.
There are a lot of reputable international organizations. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, which offer a lot of free resources that can build you in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of training and things. So the Internet Society, ISACA, ISC Squared, OAS, they offer the Caribbean region and other people a lot of free resources in terms of cybersecurity training and similar resources. Years ago, all these free resources were not available, but I think we need to really look at what is available and work with them. I know they sent offers of training programs, all sorts of things, but a lot of the nations seem not to realize that these organizations can actually help so much with cybersecurity. So I just encourage the Caribbean nations to look and see what Internet Society, ISACA, ISC Squared, OAS, and those have on offer for cybersecurity. It's really a lot. So we complain about money, but there's a lot of freeness available to us which can help.
All right, thanks for that. We have one final question that our executive said we can take, and this is from Allison. And she says she has another question regarding a certain government's recent cyber incident and their inability to have a hand on what data was breached. Is this reasonable given that most data protection laws have a requirement that persons are notified within a set timeline? And actually, Rob, you have responded saying that the more urgent of those two problems is that the government should be aware of the breach. Deciding how to notify data subjects is important, but can be dealt with down the line unless the breach literally puts people in danger. And you're actually going into what we call our incident management response.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can go back 10 or 15 years and find people discussing, oh, well, if there's a data breach, you just have to notify everyone. And then that discussion becoming a little bit more nuanced, and people saying, well, actually, you should notify people, but not necessarily if, for instance, someone left the briefcase with the data in the canteen, but they went and got the briefcase later. So there was a breach in principle, but in practice, it didn't have an impact. The exceptions to that, where it really becomes urgent, are, for example, recent breach in the UK with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, where the names and addresses of serving officers were made public. And that literally put those officers at risk of, in some cases, death. So there you've got a much more pressing reason to notify the individual. But that is subject to graduation. And actually, it's far more important the government should be, or that the data controller should be aware of the breach in the first place. That's the priority.
All right, thanks for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Niel, you want to respond? I see you itching to respond.
Yeah, I will respond quickly. I think one of the problems that we encounter in this region, especially with the enforcement of regulations, is that our regulatory or our supervisory authorities are not independent. They're politically captured, or they're captured by the industry. So when we have independent regulators who are not being allowed to act, who are not allowed to enforce the laws, then we have situations where there's no accountability in place. No fines are enforced. There are no investigations. So basically, we have laws that don't have any teeth.
Right. Thanks for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now to the end of this, what I call an interesting discussion, which can go on for days. And I would like to firstly thank Robin Wilton, who is the Internet Society in the UK, Mr. Niel Harper, Board of Directors from ISACA, and Lieutenant Command Coast Guard David Gittens for your time this morning and for continuing imparting that needed knowledge and expertise as we discussed this morning, digital sovereignty and cybersecurity, exploring the opportunities over the internet. I'm now going to hand you back over to the chairperson of ISOC Barbados, Dr. Shamar Ward. Have a good morning all.
Thanks, everyone.